China's government has had a tumultuous relationship with the media, domestic and international alike. The practices of restricting access to trouble spots, jailing of journalists and controlling internet access have attracted criticism and condemnation. That was all supposed to change in the lead up to the Olympics, but recent events have tested Beijing's resolve and its promises. I'm Taimur Nabili, and on this edition of 101 East, we ask, how will China handle the increased scrutiny as it prepares to take center stage? In the lead up to the Olympics, China issued new regulations which supposedly allowed foreign journalists to travel anywhere and interview anyone who agreed to talk. But in the initial days of the recent riots in Tibet, international media were denied permission to travel to the country. Our Beijing correspondent Tony Cheng looks at the reality for those who were promised full access to the growing superpower's biggest stories.
Life slowly getting back to normal in Lhasa. At least that's what the Chinese government wants you to think. After the riots, a tightly controlled press visit to Tibet, open only to a small group of journalists. But even with the close attention of the media minders, they couldn't hide the anger of these monks at the Jokang temple. It's all a fake, they shout, and despite the probable repercussions, they went on to openly voice their opinions about the Chinese government. It seems that the freedom of speech, although it has a heavy price, is still alive in China. The reason for that lies here, the Bird's Nest Stadium in Beijing. In order to secure its position as host of the Olympics, the Chinese government had to give assurances that tight media restrictions would be lifted. In the past, foreign journalists had to get government permission every time they traveled beyond the capital. The new regulations introduced in 2007 were supposed to give the world a freer and wider picture of what China was really like.
Under the new regulations, all you need is the consent of the interviewee, and you can conduct the interviews. So it gives us a feeling of greater flexibility and mobility. And then the question, of course, is how well is it being implemented?
And critics of the regime, previously silenced or hidden, became accessible too. Inside this building lives Bao Tong, one of the most celebrated dissidents in China. Effectively, he's been under house arrest since 1989. But since the new reporting regulations started in 2007 because of the Olympic Games, foreign journalists have been allowed to visit him. So let's go inside. One of the reformers of 1989, Bao Tong found himself purged and jailed after the protests on Tiananmen Square. After 7 years in jail, he was moved into this block of apartments in Beijing. A comfortable prison, but a prison nonetheless. Still, after presenting our credentials, we were allowed to proceed. Waiting upstairs was one of the Communist Party's fiercest critics.
The government wants all the domestic and foreign media to say exactly what it tells them, to report positively what it regards as positive, and report negatively on things it regards as bad. It doesn't allow different opinions, and it's so harmful.
And years of isolation don't seem to have dulled his opinions. Today, as Bao Tong watches the dramatic changes taking place in China, he says he fears that while superficially things are developing, underneath the surface, the same rigid government controls remain. And while we can visit him, his access to the outside world remains tightly controlled. A huge gulf still remains between the theory of press freedom in China and the reality. It's something we've learned from bitter experience. Constantly harassed, detained and obstructed, the message that we're free to report on China doesn't seem to have got through. Even when we show the new regulations signed by Premier Wen Jiabao, the reaction is the same. This is the welcome we received in Shenyang, home of the Olympic soccer tournament. And trying to report on Tibet was virtually impossible. Still, thousands of kilometers from Lhasa, we were picked up by plainclothes police and escorted off the Tibetan plateau with no explanation. But how did the Chinese press survive? The media has become big business in China. 1 million copies of the Beijing Daily come off these presses every day, circulation figures that dwarf most Western papers. When it comes to content, though, many of the stories you see in the foreign press are absent. On TV, in the papers, even on the internet, the Chinese government still maintains a high level of control. New regulations for the Olympics only apply to the foreign journalists. Chinese journalists who dare to challenge the censor usually face demotion or worse. Mr. Huang was forced to leave his magazine after a series of reports on the plight of farmers who lost their land to corrupt officials. But he still thinks freedom of the press is a necessity, not a luxury.
Of course we need it. Freedom of speech and freedom of the press are the basics of democracy. And democracy is the fundamental foundation of a modern nation.
民主则是现代化国家的基本构建。
And that is exactly what China is trying to show the world. A modern and fast-developing nation looking to the future, not the past. But even with the attention that the Beijing Olympics will bring in the coming months, there's still little evidence of permanent or lasting change.
Well, joining me now by satellite from Beijing for today's discussion is Professor An Bin-she from Tsinghua University's School of Journalism and Communication. And here in our KL studio, freelance journalist and former president of Hong Kong's Foreign Correspondents Club, Stephen Vines. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here. An Bin-she, can I just begin with you? The events recently in Tibet and Beijing's reaction to them has raised fears once again that any pledges of open journalistic inquiry that Beijing has made will not be fulfilled. What's your response to that?
First of all, I have kind of view that actually this time Chinese government is trying to coordinate with the international community about this Tibetan riot. I think they have done what they can do, but of course, in terms, of course, they let the let the international reporter, including Al Jazeera, to go to Tibet to have interview very shortly after the incident occurs. But of course, in terms of Western professionalism, their response is slow. But compared with their response to the crisis before, I think the speed and also their openness is much improved already.
All right, Steve, the contention here is an interesting one, that perhaps according to standards that the Western media might hold, the reaction to Tibet and the delay in allowing journalists in, and indeed the entire media trip that they organized afterwards, would not have made any difference. But in comparison to previous behavior in China, there is progress to be seen. Do you agree with that?
Well, if you start from such a low level, I mean, anything is progress. I mean, let's remember that...
But that's a good thing.
Yes, indeed it is a good thing, but the fact of the matter is that 20 journalists were allowed on a very tightly controlled visit to Tibet that, as it happens, went rather disastrously wrong for the authorities. But the reality is that it's not an East-West thing. I mean, in other parts of the East, where there's been either natural catastrophes or indeed civil strife, the media has free access.
Well, it might not be an East-West thing, but when you're starting from a low base, can you really expect the standards to move from the low base to what you expect in such a short space of time?
Well, I mean, you know, don't aspire low is always my attitude. Is, you know, aim for open access. If it can be achieved at a quick pace, that's very good. If it can be achieved at a slow pace, that's not so good. And in this case, it really is a very, very slow pace indeed.
And Ben, is Beijing aiming low in its communications policy here?
And my view is that it's just like Olympics games, that this is the kind of system that the rule was set by the West. Of course, all the ethics and also the norms are set by the Western countries. So, of course, Beijing tries to follow up these rules. So, but they need a kind of process. And also considering Tibet issue was a very sensitive issue, and also this is a sort of a crisis. It's out of sudden crisis.
But
so I think,
let's put Tibet aside for just a second. Let's put Tibet aside just a second and consider the broader picture. Do you think Beijing is committed to a kind of communications and media relationship that Steve is talking about, that the West would regard as the norm?
Yes, I think since January 2007, the State Council has already issued a new decree allowing that international journalists can enter into China without any approval, or they can interview whoever they want to, wherever they want. So I think this is a kind of sort of very media-friendly response, of course, under the pressure of Olympics and the coming World Expo.
Do you
well,
like
I mean,
that?
it's interesting that you say that, because, of course, that decree is going to be removed in October of this year. So it's not exactly open access.
Yes, but my estimation is that this decree will be lasted, because if you think about the World Expo is coming 2 years later. So there's no need, actually, Chinese government will uplift this decree. The only thing I think they declare this is a temporary decree is because when they declare this openness, of course, in the year of 2007, there is some domestic pressure, both from the officials and also from the public.
It is a
but I think with the success of with the success of Olympiad, maybe the public and officials will change their mind, so the decree will be permanently implemented.
I mean, ordinarily you would think that once that step has been taken, then the progress will continue in that direction. It's a slippery slope in some senses.
It is indeed, but the problem with the decree and the openness is that when it's been tested, in practice, it simply hasn't worked. In some of the provinces, local officials have said, well, we don't care about this decree, you're not going there, you can't talk to these people. And journalists have been detained, going about their work, despite the fact that they were doing so quite lawfully under Chinese law.
So the answer to Unbind is what?
My answer is that this is the decree, so this is not a law, and this is also sort of like kind of implemented under the pressure of the Olympiad and also the World Expo. So I think the local authorities or the officials might have some nuance in implementing this policy, like you had mentioned just before. But if you consider the micro trend of this media reform, or also the openness, is there, so you cannot deny it at all.
All right, let's pause there
you
for
cannot
just a minute.
deny it by the certain cases, yeah.
All right, let's pause there for just a minute. We're going to have to take a short break. We'll be back, and when we return, we'll hear from one photographer who will show us a different side to China. Stay with us.